The debt limit ceiling. Uh, Welcome to Distant Dat, 20 December 2024. Not too many days left of that. I'm going to continue yakking about the Cambridge Capital controversy. I begin with a quote from David Ricardo that what is economics? To determine the laws of which regulate the distribution between rent, profit, and wages, among rent, profit, and wages. It's the principal problem in political economy. The Cambridge Capital controversy, sort of an interesting problem that needs to be returned to. Well, maybe not needs to. Some people have not really fully tackled it because perhaps, as some would argue, there is no argument. There is actually. It is the significant division still being worked out between a connection between capital events at a lower or smaller or regional level and a kind of global model of the problem of growth. It is simply perhaps a siding, a detour for some folks to talk about it as a way to uh, think about certain types of transformations, particularly on the issue of capital switching or re-switching. And there is a literature on this. The nice thing or the interesting thing about it is that it can be empirical, and there's at least one moderately recent article on discussing Spanish real estate, which may or may not be interesting to people, but I actually think that there's probably data, um, and it's actually sort of worked through in an interesting way. And so I'll yak about that in a moment. But Joan Robinson argued, inter alia, that the theory has no logical explanation of income distribution, she suggested. The explanation in reality was the bargaining power of the owners of the factors of production. And that probably is a better example. And financialization, I think, proves that, or more recent work on problems of financialization, I think, are good examples of that. So, but in the 1960s, Paul Samuelson, after an unsuccessful but spirited defense of neoclassical economics, conceded that Joan Robinson was right. She still didn't get a Nobel Prize, but said he would choose to continue believing in orthodox economics, even if only as a matter of faith. And that doesn't tell us much at an ideological level about the firmness of neoclassical economics. Well, the math always works, and that's because they sort of defined out all the problems that are actually the more interesting ones, the ones that are more critical. It is a tendency to simplify in that sense. Most orthodox economists have done the same. This is quite true. It is so much arguing about this. Steve Keen, of course, has a really good observations on why this is that sort of the doctrinal the dogmatism, I suppose, of neoclassicism that can easily be resisted by a certain other analysis. So this is the Wikipedia stuff that sort of discusses the difference that is the heart of the debate between neoclassical economists and Keynesian or post-Keynesian economists. Latter group argues that growth is primarily growth, demand driven because growth in the labor force as well as labor productivity both respond to the pressure of demand, both foreign and domestic. Their view does not mean post Keynesian state that demand growth determines supply growth without limit. Rather, they claim that there is not one single full employment growth path, and that in many countries, demand constraints related to excessive inflation and balance of payments difficulties tend to arise long before supply constraints are ever reached. So this is, and to even frame it as a supply demand kind of issue is to, capitulate, I suppose, to Alfred Marshall's Marshallian kind of logic. Marshallian logic was really important, and there's scant evidence that Marx, for example, was kind of appealed to that sort of idea, at least in later life. But maybe it's there. Somebody needs to hunt that down. So anyway, Galbraith on this is the critique of Robinson and Sraffa is more than 4 years old, yet for psychological and political reasons rather than for logical and mathematical ones, the capital critique has not penetrated mainstream economics. It likely never will, as I quoted this yesterday. Today, only a handful of economists seem aware of it. Ostensible liberals are not exempt. Their arguments for higher public infrastructure investment based on its alleged marginal productivity are precisely of this type, as are arguments for increased investment in education based on the higher marginal productivity of human skill. It's all, it's all sort of there. And you could see that the Biden administration, without making too pointed a comparison, is sort of talking about that. And note, of course, that the people who are going to be in charge in a couple of weeks are totally against these kinds of things. Or they're going to talk about infrastructure week, for 4 years. Again, we're going to have an infrastructure week again. Infrastructure week will be back. That is the trope or meme that Trump would sort of yammer on about during his first term as we're going to have something to say about it in 2 weeks. So it's always 2 weeks away, not unlike the Republican health plan, which still, they have a concept of a plan. So they have a sort of a fleeting thought of a plan, and that's kind of the same damn difference. The fact is that these kinds of things they're totally against, and killing off, for example, the federal Department of Education is just one aspect of that. Now, reswitching means that there is this idea of switching or moving capital back and forth is an important idea because, in fact, there are multiple lags in capital, and Marx is trying to account for those. And of course, what is useful or important for looking at David Harvey's work is to see that he's taken that and applied it in this kind of infrastructure way. That is to see that, you sort of stuff kind of moves around when interest rates move or when profitability moves. And you can see how that did happen, even in the kind of, mundane examples like a financialization example, which is more extreme and not necessarily represented by infrastructure, although it ultimately does, because you could see in terms of urban growth and sprawl and development, land development, et cetera, that's kind of what's going on. And, some people won't cop to that. And they're too busy kind of measuring other things, that hedge funds and, sort of predatory private equity firms and all that sort of stuff are actually part of doing exactly this. No one wants to identify it quite in this way, but this is a frame that's worth still considering. Reswitching means there's no simple monotonic relationship between the nature of the techniques of production used and the rate of profit. That is, it's not as simple For example, we may see a situation in which a technique of production is cost minimizing at low and high rates of profit, but another technique is cost minimizing at intermediate rates. So you just the fact that things are moving back and forth. Now that's you know, uh, without going through a lot of arm waving, and there is a lot of arm waving, and there's math. Um, this is the Wikipedia version of this, and this is kind of where you have this kind of set of arguments. But the fact of the matter is, as a lot of ink got spilled, and the reality, as in the Wikipedia thing says, recent work includes empirical applications using input-output data, applications to environmental economics, and analysis of the properties of random matrices. A demonstration that the Cambridge Capital controversy applies to non-competitive markets with markup pricing and extensions of work with fixed capital. Now, here's a graph from that Spanish article I was just talking about. And I think you can see that there is the possibility of tracing the switching model back and forth. And what's interesting, of course, is the difference between 2000 to 2007, 2014 to 18, and comparing two sequences of kind of growth rates, of systems of growth rates. So, the author tries to get this to work out and identifies what I think the same sorts of things, not identical, but the same sorts of things that we're looking at with Hudson's discussion of financialization. That is, there are rentier circuits based on interests, on sale of existing real estate, and on building and selling new real estate. And it's the shifts back and forth that are the more important ones because they are transactional shifts. They signify certain varieties or types of financialization, which I think is really the more important element. And the fact that there's lots of empirical data for this, some of which is fairly crucial in terms of, at least urban development. But if you want to think about it in the American context, I would assert that these same ideas still exist. You can define, for example, gentrification and regentrification using some of these ideas. And the fact is, you sort of still need an army of researchers to sort of get this to work out properly. And trying to get there led me to some other more crazy readings and research. There is an argument between two guys, and I'm not sure that it's been fully explicated, but maybe it's only left for historians of political economy, and that is Alfred Marshall's theory of rent, which gives us this front-end moment of how to talk about, seeking certain kinds of things, ideas about, essentially about capital or versions of capital. And but he gets critiqued by somebody, and this may be another, obtuse and sort of trivial argument in the literature, but it's sort of an example that, some people get a little kind of irritated, perhaps, at criticisms of their work. So this occurred, 120 years ago, but this fellow by the name of Frank Fetter identified several concepts of rent in Alfred Marshall's work that he attacked as contradictory, arguing that Marshall embraced classical errors while still attempting to emancipate himself from them. You see how that could annoy someone. Marshall responded by adding a critical note on Fetter to the fifth edition of his Principles, but otherwise showed little public interest in a reply. That's probably the best way that you can defend yourself, I suppose. However, archival evidence reveals that both Marshall and Fetter took this dispute seriously and personally, and that they continued to debate each other at a distance for several decades. Needless to say, this sort of stuff happens in academia all the time, and it's really sort of unfortunate. It's kind of the academic politics. The American version of it is also quite weird and insidious, and ranges not just simply in economics, but for example, the there's well, without getting too far in the weeds, but discussions of whether there was or wasn't a sufficient implication of German capitalists in the Holocaust, et cetera, is always an amusing set of arguments, and it got waged by a bunch of folks many decades ago, and it's always interesting to see how some of them sort of leak over into personnel policy. Some people's inability to get tenure or a new job, um, because of the kind of scurrilous nature of theoretical arguments that should not verge into those areas. It should simply, did you have a good argument? Did you explicate it well? Did you do, to speak of science, are there falsifiable elements? Blah, blah, blah. So anyway, this paper brings to light, this particular one on Old Brent and Alfred Marshall brings to light previously unknown archival sources, including unpublished notes, correspondence, and manuscripts, the same things that are going on with Marx and the MIGA, that is Marx Engels, the new sort of archives, to tell the full story of the controversies. Doing so sheds new light on the work of both men and adds in several ways to our understanding of the early history of neoclassical economics, of the development of the theory of rent, and of theoretical paths not taken. I think it's the theoretical paths not taken that that's where switching and reswitching goes. Now, unfortunately, starting to read that article led me off to topics that I hadn't looked at in years, and that is the concept of quasi-rent. And the problem with discussing certain literatures is that it's kind of a coding and decoding argument. You sort of have to say, alrighty, now there's rent that Marshall believes is viable, and then there's, Ricardian rent, and then Marx's concept of rent, sort of going to the third volume of Capital, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to sort of sort all those damn things out. It's a place where analytic Marxism never got to, which I suppose why I have been and still am sort of interested, not profoundly, because, and needless to say, other people have plumbed that depth and have made certain, historical adjustments in their own research. So the concept of quasi-rent was given by Alfred Marshall. He defined quasi-rent, quasi-rent, like Quasimodo, as surplus earnings generated by the factors of production, except land. The earnings from machines and instruments are termed as quasi-rent. Now, it may in fact be that quasi-rent, is a useful term. On the other hand, it may simply be that, when Marx is talking about the differences among, sort of constant variable, capital, blah, 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 that's really covers the issue. But as a term, it has persisted, and there is a literature, particularly because of Buchanan and a bunch of other folks. I think that rent, quasi-rent, et cetera, gets sort of inserted into the literature. The quasi-rent refers to the income produced when the demand for products increases suddenly. Is used for a short period of time. So this is a distinction mentioned mostly in microeconomics text. In economic rent, the supply of factor is fixed, such as land. However, in quasi-rent, the supply of factor is temporary and can be increased or decreased after some time, such as the use of machines. For example, there's a sudden increase in the demand for houses, but the supply of houses does not increase with that speed because of the limited building material. This is what I've been talking about in terms of lags, particularly when you're talking about physical infrastructure. It all doesn't come together all at once. This may change if we get more prefabricated housing or, 3D printing of houses, but really not that yet. Although it would be an interesting argument to look at certain types of industries on the basis of what counts as rent in that particular context. You'd have to make a lot of adjustments, and maybe it's not worth following. But for example, if you were looking at manufactured housing or RVs, which may be too extreme, but there's a certain way in which you can look at it and talk about it and say that this using the short term and the long term suddenly get compressed together. The sudden increase in the return from selling of houses is termed as a quasi rent. Quasi rent is regarded as a surplus that is temporary in nature. When the building material would be available, then the surplus amount would be automatically be eradicated. Well, yes and no. Similarly, same type of surplus arises in the case of other goods, such as ships, machines, and automobiles. So to generalize that would be interesting. It does need to be worked through, and yes, there's a whole bunch of more reading that I have to do, but there is a difference between that Marshall is making, at least in this context, and in reference to Ricardian rent, more specifically. Pure rent is a payment to the land, while quasi rent is paid to factors like labor, capital, and organization. So, this is just it's a distinction without a difference in the sense of the Marxian land, labor, capital distinction. So all you're doing is adding a different term or an additional term. The supply of land is fixed permanently. Pure rent is therefore permanent, whereas other instruments of production like machinery and buildings are temporarily limited. Therefore, quasi-rent is temporary. And, you can see how the assumptions move along here. With an increase in population and subsequent increased demand for land, the pure rent has a tendency to increase progressively. Now, there's a whole problem there that needs to sort of be worked out. But quasi-rent diminishes progressively and disappears finally when the supply of factors of production becomes elastic. This issue of elasticity is the one that sort of persists, the Marshallian persistence on the issue of whether, and this is a math thing, right? Inelasticity to elasticity and inelasticity as functions of, from 0 to 1, blah, blah, blah. According to Stonier and Haig, in the long run, not unlike Keynes talking about the long run, this rent disappears for it's not true rent, but an ephemeral reward. So on the one hand, it's important, but maybe not so important, which doesn't really quite get us anywhere. Quasi-rent arises when the factors are heterogeneous and their supply is perfectly inelastic. These conditions are, this is setting it at 0. These conditions are found in the labor and capital, and therefore quasi-rent emerges, but these conditions are not present in land. Quasi-rent or income arising for the fixed factors in the short period becomes part of the cost of production. In the long run, pure rent is the reward for the use of land. Pure rent is a real surplus, but quasi-rent is one of the nature of a surplus, because though it's a surplus in the short period, it becomes part of the cost of production in the long run. So there's a kind of interesting way that you can talk about it. And this, once I got sort of sidetracked on this, it means that I have to go look up and find Alfred Marshall talking about meteors. Marshall assumes 3 situations. The first situation, a meteoric shower of stones falls at one particular place. As these stones can be used for industrial purposes, the residents of the area pick up the stones. They will enjoy a pure rent equal to the rent of land. The stones, as the free gift of nature, have the same property as that of land. Their supply is perfectly inelastic to change in price. In the second situation, the supply of stones would be perfectly elastic to changes in demand, both in the short and in the long run. In this situation, pure rent arises. In the third situation, the supply of stones is neither inelastic nor perfectly elastic as in the first 2 situations. The short period fixed supply of stones can be increased in the long period in response to an increase in demand. Thus, quasi-rent accrues in the short period to people who found the stones. However, this rent disappears in the long period. Well, yes and no. And, there's another story that I have to figure out the relation to, but we were talking about this earlier about the economies built on people finding stone or harvesting stones on the beach, and you can see how far in the weeds we can get on that. Let me close with yakking about this one example of unpacking capital switching, value renterism, and displacement in absolute and relative forms of switching. This is that Spanish graph that I showed you before. Now, Harvey's switching theory has been widely used to theorize investments in the built environment. Crucially, in switching theory, no distinction has been made between investments in the construction of the newly built environment and investments into the existing built environment. The distinction between these two types of switching is key to unveiling the relations between how value is produced, rents are extracted, and interest payments are made as investments flow with the real estate sector and the implications that such switching has for displacement. And so Ishmael Yago, discusses the distinction between different types of switching and the implications thereof by analyzing the ebb and flow of investments in Spanish real estate from 2000 to 2007 and from 2014 to 2018. On the one hand, I claim that the two switching waves, these are switching waves, were qualitatively different insofar as capital was fixed in the built environment through the construction of new buildings between 2007, whereas from 2014 to 2018, capital was fixed in existing buildings. So he's trying to make a comparison between new buildings built during a period before the kind of major capital crisis, and the looking at a period when there was not capital is sort of restricted, or construction was more fixed. In the first switching phase, value was produced and land rents were extracted, whereas the second switching phase was characterized mainly by rent extraction. On the one hand, the first switching moment entailed an increase in housing provision, whereas the second switching moment led to widespread displacement of the population. So there's a lot going on here. It's kind of a preliminary conclusion that, and maybe even a problematic sort of setting up the model. But you can see that it does, in his introduction, that he's appealing to David Harvey's ideas about capital accumulation. And, capital switching theory does come from David Harvey, claiming that the investments in the built environment are the result of capital's need to alleviate its own over-accumulation crisis. Scholarship focused on empirically substantiating switching theory, and there's good literature in that. Nevertheless, one key issue that's not been addressed theoretically or empirically is the difference and the implications of such difference between capital switching investments to the built environment that is to be built, referred to as absolute switching, and capital switching to the built environment that is already built, referred to as relative switching. And so you can see the argument that he's trying to build here, that one taken from Marx or a variety of other places. You can talk about that in terms of Ricardo as well, I suppose, is relative versus absolute. And we know that the relative absolute comparison in terms of theories of value are kind of useful to think about, because they are in the context of labor, they're more complicated because some things are difficult to measure, that in terms of talking about labor power and other stuff. But in terms of buildings, some of the stuff appears to be a little bit more empirical, I suppose. In this article, I address two overarching questions. First, I analyze to what extent capital switching into the existing built environment occurs in ways that are fundamentally different from switching into newly built construction. Secondly, related to this analysis, I explore in what ways the form of capital invested in the built environment expresses itself differently in each instance. To achieve this, I address empirically the similarities and differences between the two switching periods by dissecting how the ebb and flow of investments switched in and out of Spanish real estate between 2000 and 2018. At the global scale, Spain counts among countries the highest investment levels of construction up to 2008 and the highest levels of investment by asset managers after the 2008 recession. Therefore, presents an ideal case study for investigating the variegated ways in which switching takes place. And there's a literature for this. And the important point is to think about Brett Christopher's work. Conceptually, identifying both types of switching contributes to disentangling the distinct ways in which land rents, interest payments, and profits are extracted as capital becomes fixed in the built environment. Distinguishing between the two forms of switching is also key to grasping the different social and political outcomes that arise, specifically the different forms of displacement that occur as investments in the built environment unfold. Different data have been mobilized to grasp the three empirical objectives of demonstrating the existence of capital switching, distinguishing between the two types of switching, once you've gotten that kind of work through, and exploring the origins of such investment. This can be actually pretty, complicated, but I think he does a pretty good job of it. To corroborate the existence of switching or not, statistics about investment in real estate purchase and construction have been compared to total spending on labor, wages, and machinery in Spain between 2000 and 2018, when investments in real estate increased at the same time as disinvestments in machinery and wages take place. This proves that such switching has occurred. This is Brett Christopher's sort of methodology. By comparing investments in real estate with investments in the rest of the economy, the extent of such switching can be fully grasped. The cross-national dimension of switching into the Spanish built environment has been corroborated by considering investments in housing, machinery, and other buildings in terms of data for both Spain and Germany, the latter being the main geographical source of the 2000 to 2007 switching period to Spain. So this can get you really far in the weeds, but there is a way in which you can look at certain ideas, certain concepts, and this, of course, is better if you have a lot more, sort of data and people to handle that stuff, I suppose. But the difference between international banks and lenders, Spanish banks, developers, not necessarily identical, the building contractors and construction workers, which gives us kind of labor idea, the moment of landowners, the question of transaction or transference of landowners relative to developers, the undeveloped land by comparison, the relation between, of course, commodity production that is producing the real estate and the sale of the commodities, which is different, of course, or the real estate owners, which is a transactional issue, in terms of development, and of course the role of regional governments. And so you have a lot of data that our friend Ishmael goes through, and more relevant, aside from what appears to be fairly regular looking data in terms of bank claims and development, and of course movement of capital from Germany, for example. And so there's a lot of stuff there, to squish together. But the more interesting one is, of course, in the graph that diagram that I showed at the beginning, that is annual growth of or percentage rates, and annual growth rates underlying the switching periods. And so if you identify the switching periods, you can identify them as circuits, as we've tried to see happen within the context of volume 2, and then which will follow through in terms of volume 3, and that is interest rates relative to loans and bank data on the left, the rentier circuit, based on sale of existing real estate. So you see transactions of sort of transfers of people buying, second homes or, other kinds of existing real estate transactions. And then on the right hand is the value circuit based on building and selling new real estate. So, you're trying to compare existing real estate stock, the plan for building new real estate as, shifts around where capital is going. And this is a very sort of large scale kind of set of estimations. And so it may be too gross in terms of figures, and it may need a lot more drilling down. It may, in fact, require looking at a specific region, which some of his Ishmael's sort of analysis sort of suggests. But the point is, of course, that you can identify the different things that you would measure, which is really important, all the variables. Transactions of newly built as opposed to secondhand dwellings, construction licenses, which is a very key element relative to the role of the government or the state, spending for construction workers, and the trade outs of developers on undeveloped land. And I know that may just seem very tedious to some people, but the fact is capital's moving around, and it can be you can see all this sort of stuff going around, but capital is happening. There's transformation is occurring, turnover is occurring, and some earlier work that I wanted to do that I may still do, and which is one key example of kind of the essence of thinking about a theory of virtual capital is the idea of transferring property rights, developmental property rights. So you can see that even in the Spanish example, the transfer of the property rights of the formation of development rights, which in the American context is actually kind of interesting. And so underlying this is financialization. And that's kind of really where it's going, and where you can see switching, which is useful for extension of switching activity, as applied, as Michael Hudson has identified in financialization. He doesn't talk a great deal about capital switching, but it is occurring, and there's implications of it, and you can see that it does occur. That you have good banks and bad banks, good banks and bad banks. That is, the bad banks in terms of bailing out folks and bankrupt developers, et cetera. You can see that as we look at this in the Spanish context, that some of these things were going on for people like Trump and the mysterious Deutsche Bank loan, for example, of whatever it was, 190 or $300 million. So there's stuff that that can be applied in the American context, not simply in how the Spaniards were doing this. So that's that bit of data. And I don't think I have time left to do my other little thing, was to show the remainder of the little talk between Yanis Varoufakis and Slavoj Žižek. So, but I did include that here because I just think they're funny guys. It's only sort of a sense of humor that I probably am interested in this. Although maybe I will, if we were going to try and do it, I better do it now. And Trump is a kind of fetish, so let's see if we can do this. I hope you can hear this.
Now I ask you a question, but a positive one. In your book on techno-feudalism, you even give a hint, and I would say, why not? That at a tactical level, maybe at some point, the left should even risk a tactical alliance with some small capitalists against the big corporations and so on. I shouldn't be afraid of this.
That's Lenin too.
Yeah, please. Although,
because let's face it, if you're a small-scale capitalist producing electric bicycles and you're selling them through Amazon.com or any of these platforms, Jeff Bezos is retaining 40% of the price. So essentially, you pay cloud rent, I call it, to the techno-feudal lord. So there is scope for an alliance, but of course the alliance needs a political party too. That's going to be the avant-garde. And we don't have that. You don't have the Labour Party here. Sucks.
But no, wouldn't you agree with not? I will now be really evil that United Kingdom now has a big radical center party, which is more oriented towards the right, but right center, and it's called Labour Party.
They have the proper Thatcherite party in government now, because Rachel Reeves, the moment, even before she was elected, dared say to you folks, warn you of the austerity which is now imposing on you, that the credit card of the state has been maxed out. bring George Osborne back. I mean, he was saying it in a much, much more eloquent manner because he's more educated than Rachel Reeves is. So now you have the proper Tory party in power, dressed in red.
Yeah. This is why, would you agree or not, another crucial point, political, people ask us what to do and so on. And as you said when we just debated there briefly before coming here, what Bernie Sanders, whom we both respect at some level, in contrast to the beautiful lady AOC about whom we both have serious doubts, her political orientation, but that you said that he already, when did he begin? 8, 10 years ago, 11? He should have risked a third party. Yeah. The big problem with Democrats, among others, is that they all the time focus on this fear: if we move too much to the right, we will lose the centrist workers. But I think...
To the left, you mean? If we move too much to the left.
To the left, we will lose. But Bernie already 15 years or how much ago gave a proper answer to this. I find it ingenious. He said, no, our target should not be this center. Our target should be those poor white people who otherwise vote for Trump today. And he proved that this can work in Vermont. Who are his voters? Those poor small farmers. But to make the basic point, that's important. Don't you think that now, when we have this nightmare in power, the solution should not be what radical, liberal, moderate, they think they are not center, leftist center try to convince us, now we have all to stick together. No, now it's the time to risk a third party, which a genuine leftist party, which simply says openly what it has to be done. We can go later into this communism and so on, because I think that, again, the genius of Bernie was that already at that point, again, he said our target should be those who otherwise vote for Trump. And Trump is, as you wrote about it, is literally getting strength from this gap, because he literally addresses, he is not only anti-immigrant, his anti-immigrant stance is at the same time sustained by a pseudo, not leftist, but sympathy with ordinary working people, and so on and so on. So would you agree or not that, of course, strategically, let's say we have two blocks, radical center and whatever it will be, new left. Now, I don't a priori exclude partial collaborations, like if there is a law proposed by conservatives against abortion or LGBT, whatever, no problem. We go together with them. But we must make our position clear, the left. Or do you see a problem here?
I see no problem with this whatsoever. And Bernie Sanders had the right instinct when he was saying that more than 50% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. In a country where if you fall ill, you become bankrupt and you fall out of the point of view of society. You become completely marginalized. You become a non-person.
Yeah.
And therefore, the majoritarian views within society, because let's face it, we leftists are in the majority when it comes to our position. If you were to go out there, here in Britain, and you were to say to people, what do you prefer? 300 billion to be spent on nuclear submarines that we can't even use because we don't have the keys. The Americans have not passed them on to us, from whom we have bought the nuclear submarines. Or should we put them in, social housing, so that we ameliorate the fact that, young people cannot afford to buy a house or to rent a house. 80%, deep down, they will say, of course, the nuclear submarines are a waste of time, especially if we don't have the keys to them. And if one question after the other, our positions are majoritarian. And yet the center-left parties never adopt them.
Yeah.
Never adopt them.
And that's where Trump
They are
enters.
thinking that if they become like the right, but a right that is light, you know, racist light, pro-capitalist light, that it doesn't work. And Margaret Thatcher was the one that answered the question. Because I remember she was being interviewed in 1996, just before Tony Blair was elected. And the interviewer, BBC interviewer I think it was, said to her, "But Mrs. Thatcher, why don't you like this young man, Tony Blair? He has copied everything you've ever done. And he's adopted completely your ideology." She said, "Yeah, this was my greatest success in my career because he turned the Labour Party into a version of the Tory Party." And then she continued and said, "But if you're going to vote for the Tory Party, why not vote for the actual one?" And this is why, you know, the centre-left loses time after time after time. So Bernie Sanders, I mean, I understand why if you are in the Labour Party now, you're John McDonnell, you haven't been thrown out yet, as Jeremy was, why why you're not going against the grain of the awful first-past-the-post system, which will condemn you to effectively ruin, even if you get 20% of the people. This is the tragedy of the electoral system. I can understand that, but Bernie, in 2016, he had 900,000 volunteers and a lot of money that was collected. The nomination was stolen from him in a criminal fashion by the DNC and the Hillary Clinton, and he comes out and supports Hillary Clinton. That was a mistake.
Yeah, because he still, again, thought, you know, in one of my books, I hope you will agree with the metaphor, in one of my books, I said Trump is not just a bad guy, obviously, but he is literally, in Freudian sense, a fetish figure. You know, this notion of fetish in Freud, which may appear too simple, but it's more complex. Let's drop this, where he says, fetish is in principle the last thing you see before seeing castration. No? That's why it's hair or feet or whatever before the guy undresses. Okay, let's not go into what Freud meant by this. What I want to say is that for this new pseudo-welfare, politically correct radical center, Trump is the last thing they see before they would see class struggle, social antagonism. That's why they need this demonization of Trump. Now, I'm not against demonizing Trump, but would you agree or not? We should never forget.
Demonizing Trump.
Sorry?
I am against demonizing Trump because Trump is such a poor excuse for human nature that you do not need to demonize him. You just talk bluntly about the fact that he's making promises to the dispossessed. You see, what he's very good at, at the Lacanian level, whatever, he connects with people. He tells them, I feel your pain, there is carnage in America, you have been fucked by this elite.
Which is true.
Which is true.
Which is true.
And then he makes promises which he never intends to see through. He takes the CEO of Goldman Sachs and makes him Treasury Secretary. He takes all the bastards from the real estate sector and makes them responsible for housing. He takes Kennedy and makes him responsible for health. So why do you need to demonize him? Just say that.
No, but what I want to say
the Democrats
is
will not even say that.
I agree with you.
Because they are the ones that who are part of completely destroying 60% of the American population.
Yeah, so again, I totally agree. That's my point, what you said now. It's that we should never forget, while of course, fighting Trump together with whomever when he will infringe on LGBT women's rights and so on, that Trump is a symptom of the failure of this radical center.
He's a symptom of Obama. He was the creation of Obama. Remember, Obama was elected at the height or the depth of the worst capitalist crisis since 1929. So you had the bankers who had absolutely wrecked the lives of millions of Americans. And he gets up there and says, yes, we can. Yes, we can do what? Punish the Wall Street bastards who created the circumstances of the gloom and doom of the American people, and here in the United Kingdom and in Europe and so on, and support the victims of this crisis. And what does he do? He takes Larry Summers and Tim Geithner, the two men that Bill Clinton had appointed to unleash the toxic powers, the demonic powers of Wall Street upon the American people, and he makes them responsible for two things: bailing out the bankers, and also imposing austerity on the people who voted for him. So the result is Trump.
And absolutely. And you know what's the irony here? Cruel irony that, all this just focusing on Trump, horror, deportation of immigrants. But look at the numbers under Obama's rule.
Yes.
There were more deportations, just done more discreetly than under...
Obama was deporting the parents of American citizens, of children whose parents were American citizens. That's what Obama was doing.
Yeah.
I mean, even now, Biden has created more draconian conditions at the wall separating America from Mexico than they were under Trump.
Okay, now I ask you a provocative question in the sense that how should I reply? Some of my friends who will join you in Gulag, so I don't agree with them, who say, but nonetheless, didn't Biden, like the first president who went to support auto workers' strike, didn't he nonetheless in economy did some not so bad things in economy? Or I want a reply to you so that I can answer my critics.
Absolutely, he did. He did some interesting things, but they were for show. They were not the substance. He did, I mean, symbolically it was important to go and join the picket line at the auto workers' strike. I saluted that. But what was his policies regarding industry? Where were his policies regarding the vast number of people who, as I said before, once they fall ill, they go bankrupt and they simply are annihilated? Nothing. He was always in the pocket of the pharmaceutical industry, of the medical industrial complex. He always bent over backwards to accommodate the needs of the rentiers, of the financiers. So when it comes to making a choice between the two sides, look, I understand, look, I wish both of them had lost the election.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? I wish both of them had lost. I would not have voted for either of them. I do not condone anyone who says that because Kamala Harris is X, Y, Z, and so on, I'm going to vote for Trump. There's always Jill Stein. There's always abstention, where you can express yourself, and there is always political activism to create an alternative. But especially, in 2016, you and I were on different camps. You don't remember that?
Where? With regard to
with regard to the American election. Because you were saying, vote for Trump, or you had said it once in 2016.
Yeah. Whereas I still think I was right, but that's another point. Yeah, I can explain why.
Maybe. But Noam Chomsky and I were on stage at the New York Public Library, and somebody asked us, and we said, both of them, we were not coordinated. We said, if you are in a safe seat, in a safe constituency, vote for Jill Stein, vote for the third party. But if you are in a swing state, hold your nose like that and vote for Clinton so as to avoid a Trump presidency. This was but now,
absolutely,
I would, in the 2024 election, my point was, Genocide Joe, the Joe Biden and the Kamala Harris, who looked at the American people who were struggling and demanded of them that they celebrate the great economy. They were telling them, you're wrong, inflation is finished. Why are you complaining? You're fools. Whereas Trump was saying, I feel your pain. Now at that point, I think the radical position and the democratic position and the ethical position and the dialectical position to say neither nor.
No, I totally agree with you, and you know whom you quote here? It's not meant only by irony. From time to time, I'm not a Stalinist, sorry. Stalin
From time to time, he's not a Stalinist.
Yeah, Stalin produced a nice paradox. You know, when in late 20s he was asked which deviation is worse, rightist or leftist. He said, not both are equally bad, but they are both worse. And that should be.
Yeah.
Kamala and Trump, they are both worse. So it's where maybe, you know where I oscillated. Now we are not attacking each other, but I sincerely want party guidelines for you. Many people with whom I had contact there, they said, okay, but at an ordinary daily level, if Trump wins, we will be deprived of abortion, more racism, and so on. So, nonetheless,
look,
should we? That's one of the arguments.
On the question of abortion, on the question, I have enormous empathy for every woman of reproductive age in the United States, because the removal of basic human rights for women under that Supreme Court and under the Trump administration is a major defeat for humanity. There's no doubt about that. There's no doubt about that. But we cannot think on a single issue. Kamala Harris, in my view, because she simply would not be in control of her own government, it would be the neocons behind, would be a clear and present threat to world peace. The Democrats, they have never seen the people who are amongst the cabal that is ruling the Democratic Party now, and they're neocons. You know, the Cheneys and the Wolfowiczes have moved from the Republican Party and were the Democratic Party. These people have never seen a war they don't like. And I very much fear, however mad and sad and bad Trump is, that under the Democrats, the rest of the world would be in much greater peril under the Democrats.
I tend to agree with you, and I will give you a proof. No way, in whatever way we can make fun of Trump and so on, but sorry, although it failed, by simply contacting Kim Jong-un, North Korea, the tension was eased. Trump did a surprising thing. You remember when there was tension in Korea, the true madman, who is now, of course, on the Democratic side, John Bolton,
of course,
wanted, we sent 2,000, and Trump fired him, said, no, I don't want world war, and so on.
Not only that, he stopped the US Air Force. The planes were in the sky about to bomb Tehran, and Trump woke up in the middle of the night and stopped that. My great fear is that he may not prevent a clash between the United States armed forces and the Chinese ones. Because the whole of the American system, even those who disagree with the persecution of the Ukrainian war, even those who disagree with the continuing genocide in Palestine, by the way, it is remiss of us not to have mentioned the genocide in Palestine, which is unfolding as we speak, with whole people being pulverized. Even those people, they are gung-ho about a possible confrontation, even a military one with China. And that is completely bipartisan in the United States. That's a clear and present danger. But let me, because we can talk about Trump forever, and I don't think it deserves it.
Listen, this will interest you, I'm sorry. I am trying in a very friendly way, we can talk normally, to bring out a possible, not even difference, but you know, okay, I'll put it like this. I was once in Japan, and I was told, if you don't agree with a guy, how do you say it there? And I was told, probably a lie, that the polite Japanese way is to say, I totally agree with you, I would just maybe put a slightly different accent, which I will say now and tell you. But you know why maybe we made some different formulations, although I paid my price for supporting Palestinians, that Frankfurt Book Fair, not as heavy price as you, but I'm also now absent from the media in Germany.
That is a badge of honor.
Yeah, but look, I am not, in contrast to you, maybe, I'm not sure, critical of Hamas from this standard liberal position and so on. My problem is this one. I see definitely here Israel, now it's becoming absolutely clear, the main culprit, and this war absolutely unconditionally served Israel. Israel literally needed this war. Here I draw a parallel, would you agree, between Israel and Iran. In both countries, we have the same problem. Do you remember? It's absolutely clear to remember it. Do you remember what happened in Iran a year before this crisis? Magda Assimi, that Kurdish woman killed, and then this triggered a feminist movement, much more authentic and radical than all the Western upper-class, liberal, politically correct feminism, because it triggered a general movement. Yeah. All the Kurds joined it, ordinary Iranians joined it, and as my friends told me there, I have strange connections everywhere in Iran, that it was clear that Iranian nomenclatura needed also a new tension with, not a war like now, but with Israel to control the situation. But wait a minute, the same goes for Israel. Remember what went on in Israel just a couple of months before October attack. Hundreds of thousands of people, mega demonstration against Netanyahu's attempt to take over Supreme Court and so on and so on. And they needed this war. That's
okay. I will. I went over time, and let me shut this down and return us to your regular programming. Needless to say, I think we're still going to do after hours at 7 o'clock. There's going to be Twilight Zone, I assume, tonight. This weekend, I've offered to show on, I think on Saturday, Lust Caution by Ang Lee, because Susanna is not going to be able to present. I'm not sure whether we will or won't. I assume we will have Star Trek on Sunday. So that's my assumption in terms of the schedule. Let me stop share and return us back to